Some say time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Duncan. I'm a curator at the Singapore Art Museum, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to tonight's online event, Free to Choose, a desktop lecture by Bahar Noorizadeh. This is the 6th episode in Sam's Skill Futures series, a digital commissioning platform consisting of performances, workshops, and lectures that elaborate on advances of intelligence, issuing for minor histories, and inviting artistic practices that consider the screen as a speculative medium of the future. I hope these ideas interest you as much as they do us, so do look out for upcoming programs as part of this series. Skill Futures is initiated by SAM curator 𝘍𝘳𝘦𝘮 𝘍𝘳𝘦𝘮. A special thanks to 𝘍𝘳𝘦 for the invitation to host this program with Bahar, to my colleagues Anissa and Angelica, and to everyone else at SAM who makes Skill Futures possible. Tonight, we're joined by Bahar Noorizadeh, an artist, writer, and filmmaker who looks at the relationship between art and capitalism. In her practice, Noorizadeh examines the conflictual and contradictory notions of imagination and speculation as they suffuse one another. Her research investigates the histories of economics, cybernetic socialism, and activist strategies against the financialization of life and the living space, asking what redistributive historical justice might look like for the present. Noorizadeh is also the founder of 𝘊𝘩𝘰𝘰𝘴𝘦is, a co-authored and socially connected project that traces economic imaginaries extraordinary to financial arrangements of our times. Check it out at 𝘊𝘩𝘰𝘰𝘴𝘦is.com. Tonight, Bahar will be sharing some of the reference points underpinning Free to Choose, an operatic financial sci-fi, or sci-fi, in which we encounter the credit banking system as a time-traveling machine. Commissioned for SAM's open systems platform, Free to Choose was born out of a collaboration between Noorizadeh, 𝘊𝘩𝘰𝘰𝘴𝘦, and Waste Paper Opera, an experimental music theater collective founded by Clara Coffin and James Oldham, along with Gary Chung, Anna Palmer, Cameron Graham, Chihiro Ono, and the Waste Paper Opera Chorus. A reminder that tonight's program will be recorded, and if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function so that we can try to address them at the end of the evening. Now that all the housekeeping is out of the way, I'll turn it over to you, Bahar.
Thanks so much, Duncan, and thanks to Sia, Anissa, everyone at Singapore Art Museum for both helping out, with the production of this film, which, as Duncan said, was a collaboration between myself, 𝘊𝘩𝘰𝘰𝘴𝘦, this brilliant visual artist in Brazil, and Waste Paper Opera, an experimental opera group in London. So this is actually a great occasion because I felt like I was able to tap into all the background research of this work that's somewhat turned out abstracter than the 4-year-long research that went behind it. So maybe, without further ado, I just get into this visual lecture or lecture performance, however you want to call it. I'm going to share my screen. Share sound.
FBI, show me your hands!
You okay?
Yeah, I'm good. Just
In the movie Skyscraper, Dwayne Johnson, a US war veteran turned security consultant, is solicited at the start of the film by the Hong Kongese real estate mogul Xiaolong-Ji to assess security for the 244-story building, the Pearl, standing supposedly somewhere around the Kowloon side of Hong Kong's Victoria Harbour. In a key scene in the trailer, Johnson is delivering his expert opinion to Zhao. He says,
The Pearl is the tallest, most advanced building in the world. You've built a vertical city. but you've brought with it every single safety and security challenge that I could think of.
We thought this floor was empty.
So did I.
Not only have you brought them all indoors, but you've trapped them 240 floors in the air. No one really knows what would happen if things go wrong.
Later in the film, the risk is transpired in the shape of an international terrorist organization setting the building on fire, leaving Johnson to spend the rest of the movie single-handedly saving the situation. I haven't seen the movie myself since most reviews call it a really bad copy of Die Hard. But there's a whole genre of skyscraper fire movies in the history of cinema, verifying a collective anxiety around entrapment in these hazardous environments. The story of social housing in Hong Kong also is built upon a historic fire. On Christmas Eve 1953, a fire devastated the 𝘍𝘳𝘦𝘦 squatter settlement in northwest Kowloon, leaving 50,000 without shelter overnight. The sensational event, the story goes, triggered quick reaction from the British colonial government, leading to the extraordinary construction of more than 1 million social housing units by 2015. That is, a territory recognized for being a free market utopia on Earth, by 1986 had 45% of its population housed in social housing buildings provided by the government.
Freedom requires individuals to be free to use their own resources in their own way. And modern society requires cooperation among a large number of people.
But why there was so much hype around social housing in Hong Kong in the later half of the 20th century? These monotonous blocks with awfully drab aesthetics became the locus of worldwide debates around the viability of the laissez-faire system for ordinary people. Most notably, in the gang of advocates was Milton Friedman, one of the primary ideologists of free market capitalism, who lauded Hong Kong as the chief success story to his theories, enabled by the British colonial policy of positive non-interventionism, where the non-intervention stood for the freedom of the market liberated from government provision.
It's hot, sticky, and extremely noisy. The workers are highly skilled, so they can command high wages. They could induce their employer to improve working conditions by offering to work for less, but they would rather accept the conditions, take the high wages, and spend them as they wish. That's their choice. The best-known statement of the principles of a free market, the kind of free market that operates in Hong Kong, was written on the other side of the world.
When governments try to control the economy, what goes wrong? Milton Friedman looks at modern governments in action, in Britain, in India, and here in the United States. Don't miss his stark and realistic assessment of the real world we live in. Free to Choose, next week.
Because our grandparents went through that stage for us, start at a higher point.
Hong Kong is not just an example. The story of how neoliberalism transformed the cities all around the world is directly connected to the myth of Hong Kong as a free market utopia. An ideology that, as Friedman said, was written on the other side of the world, traveled backwards to shape Margaret Thatcher's urban policy in the UK of the 1980s. A key figure in this intellectual homecoming was the English urbanist and town planner, Peter Hall. For most of his life, Hall was recognized as a staunch leftist, chairing the eminent British socialist think tank, the Fabian Society. But he had a change of heart during the 70s recession, and after multiple visits to Hong Kong, he was also convinced that the British system should adopt its colony's laissez-faire model. Hall and his allies published a non-plan manifesto, a tongue-in-cheek critique of government planning and a praise for deregulation. They write, "The notion that the planner has the right to say what is right is really an extraordinary hangover from the days of collectivism in left-wing thought, which has long ago been abandoned elsewhere." To tackle urban decay in the UK, non-planners proposed the construction of what would be called enterprise zones, to seize on a few appropriate zones of the country which are subject to a characteristic range of pressures and use them as launchpads for non-planning. That is, suspending the state's regulatory chokehold and exerting lax tax rates, what they called an experiment in freedom. Just as Thatcher's administration took on the idea, the Cato Institute in the US also adopted the agenda, and to this date, thousands of enterprise zones are built in the US and hundreds in the UK, France, and Italy. Just to familiarize you with the British non-planners, here's Cedric Price, one of the co-authors of the manifesto.
In the blurb about cities and time, I've already said why I think it's important to think about that. I haven't said it tonight, but I've written it in the blurb. But degrees of acceptance of the truth should be considered. That is that it's not all about truth as such. Certainly if we're talking about useful prediction, or indeed amenable extrapolation, then in fact the truth is already brought into question. Therefore, phrases, "that which once worked but now doesn't, but is assumed for convenience to do so," should be taken in our stride. There are others. That which never worked, never will do, but is always assumed to do so, should be questioned. And there are others less moral than that, such as that which never worked, doesn't work now, probably won't work in the future, but all of us like to think that it does, should be accepted. Postage stamps. Think of that one, and why they were invented.
Today, enterprise zone mentality is embodied in the likes of Paul Romer, the economist who won the Nobels a few years ago, who came up with the idea of charter cities, a wholesale trade-off between governments of developing countries, Uganda and Madagascar, for instance, and developed countries like Canada and the US, to leave tracts of land to be built by their corporations and trading citizenship with jobs, as the residents of charter cities would have no say in their urban policies. If they don't like it, they may leave, as he says.
Cities on uninhabited land. You start from uninhabited territory, people can come live under the new charter, but no one is forced to live under it. The final thing we need are choices for leaders. And to achieve the kind of choices we want for leaders, we need to allow for the potential for partnerships between nations. Cases where nations work together, in effect, de facto, the way China and Britain work together to build first a little enclave of the market model and then scale it throughout China. In a sense, Britain inadvertently, through its actions in Hong Kong, did more to reduce world poverty than all the aid programs that we've undertaken in the last century. So if we allow for these kind of partnerships to replicate this again, we can get those kinds of benefits scaled throughout the world. In some cases, this will involve a delegation of responsibility, a delegation of control from one country to another to take over certain kinds of administrative responsibilities. Now, when I say that, some of you are starting to think, well, is this just bringing back colonialism? It's not, but it's important to recognize that the kind of emotions that come up when we start to think about these things can get in the way, can make us pull back, can shut down our ability and our interest in trying to explore new ideas. Why is this not like colonialism? The thing that was bad about colonialism, and the thing which is residually bad in some of our aid programs, is that it involved elements of coercion and condescension. This model is all about choices, both for leaders and for the people who will live in these new places, and choice is the antidote to coercion and condescension. So let's
This pretty much sums up these people's theory of choice. Regarding Hong Kong, another such half-truth is the origin story of the 𝘍𝘳𝘦𝘦 fire. According to anthropologist Alan Smart, there had been hundreds of deadly fires prior to this, of course, which kept building on the dissatisfaction. The sensational story of 𝘍𝘳𝘦𝘦 was indeed highlighted to spice up the same benevolent colonial persona. Picture all of Britain as Dwayne Johnson, basically. The mythological policy of British non-interventionism have since been criticized by many. According to them, the government did indeed have a major hand in industrial planning, half by design and half by accident. Initially, the colonial government was against the welfare state, but the growing number of immigrants from China nearly tripled in a decade until 1950s and quintupled by 1960s, brought about a slew of unpredicted problems, from food resources to health and hygiene. In practice, the British had no choice but to adopt an active state policy. To meet the bare minimum standards, the government enacted affordable healthcare, public education, and subsidized transit. But the most impressive and influential of these projects have been the massive public housing scheme, where people in the squatter settlements were transferred to over the decades. Land clearance is one obvious motivation for this policy, as land has been scarce in Hong Kong and had to be cleared of the squats for better use. Besides, social welfare allowed keeping wages and so labor costs down. Cheap labor, in turn, allowed small businesses to flourish. Low-risk entrepreneurism explains the success of Hong Kong's industries. 21 families migrating from China in 1949 started this export-oriented manufacturing scene. Having the safety net of social welfare allowed them to change their products or close down and rebrand according to the needs of the market fairly easily. Last but not least, a major cause for the booming development of Hong Kong was, of course, geopolitics. China had been involved with most aspects of Hong Kong's economy, using the city as an entrepot to the rest of the world. Maintaining Hong Kong's status quo was always a priority to China, so it actually helped support the colonial government on its soil. Whatever the intentions behind the program, the very much interventionist British non-interventionism had a major ripple effect on the future of Hong Kong. That is, laying down an infrastructure of institutional and administrative networks that would connect the city directly to the larger network of globalized finance.
The history of the world is that countries may, somehow from their governments, obtain economic liberty, but the history is that that is always followed eventually by personal and political liberty. It's a question of time. You can't be half free.
When you fell down in front of the great halls of people after meeting with Deng Xiaoping, many people saw that as an omen. So what were you thinking when that happened, or what did you think when that happened?
I was actually looking up at the cameras at the bottom, because they were looking, and I had very high heels on, and those steps are rather more narrow than the ones I was used to having, and the heel caught on the edge of the step, and so my ankle went. And that's all it was, just bad luck. I think it's applying the history, which necessarily is what happened in the past, to the prophecy for the future.
According to Manuel Castells, sociologist of network cities, the age of globalization and information economy, despite expectations, did not lead to the end of the city and decentralization from metropolitan centers. Advanced services are not scattered around the globe and connected to their partners via Zoom. Quite the contrary, today there is even more agglomeration in these centers than ever. In most countries, the highest growth in employment and investment also happens in these mega metropolitans. Apart from the three major players of global economy, New York, London, and Tokyo, there are several mid-sized metropolitans that cover a range of functions, from future contracts to emerging markets and finance and business services. So how come internet did not assist with the material physical decentralization? Wasn't that the whole point, as everyone imagined yet again, that we've stepped into the decentralized paradigm after the COVID crisis, where the remote work model is going to topple the primacy of cities? The answer is manifold, but as urban sociologist Saskia Sassen writes, in the information age, the role of the cities has changed. Besides all their previous functions, now cities are mission control centers for the entire market network and places where innovation in the industry happens. These clandestine activities must happen face-to-face, still very much in the cliched manner, over exclusive lunch meetings or golf games. Eavesdropping and intelligence espionage are the greatest phobia of the information elite. Telecommunication is essentially data stored before being shipped. There is always a record somewhere. If you were wondering, Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are more concerned about their privacy than any of us.
The risk is my company's. The risk is mine.
The risk is my company's. The risk is mine. The risk is my company's.
The risk is my company's. The risk is mine. is my company.
The risk is my company's.
The risk is mine.
The risk is my company's.
The risk is my company's. The risk is mine.
The risk is my company's. The risk is mine. The risk is my company's. The risk is mine. The risk is mine. The risk is mine. The risk is my company's. The risk is mine. The risk is mine. The risk is my company's. The risk is mine. The risk is mine.
But as is the case in the 21st century, there is no actual physical gates and barricades to separate these spaces, the lunch table, the golf course, pools. In a democratic society, society of choice, so to speak, as Romer describes earlier, elites have to segregate themselves and control the resources already in their possession by other means. This implicit cover-up happens, as Castells writes, in two primary ways. One, through the cultural codings, the lifestyle, so to speak, that bars or grants access in a symbolic way. Second, the elite builds partitions basically through real estate pricing. The clandestine meetings happen in actual physical locations, leisure-oriented or residential, headquarters, near arts and cultural activities. He calls this new form of spatiality the space of flows, the material support of simultaneous social practices communicated at a distance. The space of flows consists of three layers. One, the circuit of electronic exchanges, which is the fiber optic cables to personal and corporate computers to electronic devices. Second is the nodes and hubs, which are the sites with which each network occupies. Cocaine production sites of Bolivia or Peru are connected to Colombia, to headquarters in California, which are connected to financial centers in Miami or Panama, to trafficking networks in Mexico, to distribution centers in Europe. And lastly, the people, the managerial elite, their citizenships, allegiances, how they move around the globe. Majority of the people live in the space of places, where the elite live in the space of flows. If the space is not a unitary social concept in the information age, there must be various conceptions of time necessitating these spatial forms, or delivering or deriving from them too. For example, contrary to the industrial human clock, sleeping 8 hours, checking in 9 to 5 at work, etc., capital does not sleep. Global cities allowed for the movement of capital around the clock. As London sleeps, the firm's headquarters in Tokyo wakes up. Accumulating assets for the capitalist means passive income. You want to make money while you're asleep. No matter how much in our workaholic schedules we shorten sleep hours, we can't compete with capitalism's incessant insomnia. The other notion of time comes from financialization, debt instruments, insurance policies, and derivatives. All these are mining mechanisms that bank on the future. They cash in on future insecurity and future risk and turn global instability into cash flow for a few. Today's time arrives from the future. As Yannis Varoufakis, political economist and Greek ex-minister of finance, wrote in the book to his daughter about economy, if entrepreneurs are time-traveling opportunists, bankers are their incorrigible travel agents, the gatekeepers of time travel. This is how Hong Kong became an important node in the network of global capital. Fast forward to 1987. What's been the fate of social housing since? Between 1987 to the turn of the century, manufacturing in global cities slowly shifted to service industries. In the case of Hong Kong, Chinese economic reforms motivated the industrialists to relocate to the mainland to take advantage of lower wages. The private sector became the new theme for city planning, and there were loans and incentives put into place for new home ownership programs, so to motivate the sandwich class to purchase their own homes. But in 1997, with the Asian economic crisis, the government suspended its home ownership scheme. To stabilize the property market as the prices dropped to a record low, a series of policies called the 𝘊𝘩𝘦𝘦 measures were implemented by the government, which also included halting land auctions and the selling of public housing. The shortage of land supplies as a consequence arguably triggered the beginning of the real estate boom and the developer monopoly in Hong Kong, a full-blown epidemic in 2023. As an analyst from the global Asian investment group CLSA recently said, property is Hong Kong's national sport. The state market nexus in Hong Kong is the same as before the handover, but is even more dysfunctional. When I was in Hong Kong in the summer of 2019, I was watching the second season of the German Netflix series Dark while the protests were unfolding on the street. Dark shows a fictional town which is caught up in an entangled set of time loops marking every 33 years. As characters transit through the wormhole that's situated in a cave in the forest, a father finds out that his search for his disappeared son in a different timeline might very well be the cause of his son's disappearance in the first place. Time travel has been a familiar literary and cinematic device manifesting the fragility of causal connections and the linear time narratives. To the previous notions of contemporary time, the backward moving time of finance or the insomniac time of trade, we could perhaps add Hong Kong's very own site-specific time narrative. In this weird time, China is already here and the British have never left. That is 2047, the year that Hong Kong has to adopt the Chinese mainland system of governance, is directly linked to 1997 and 1947 in a perpetual recursive loop packed with apparitions and premonitions, a sort of contractual unconscious like Dark's 33-year time loop patterns. This presence of premonitions and ghosts are manifest in the Network City project that Hong Kong is a part of today. The megacity that is the ultimate form of urbanization in the 21st century has first appeared in Eastern Asia as early as early 90s. Many, including Peter Hall, the theorist of enterprise zones, to Manuel Castells, have been prophesizing about the metropolitan region that would stretch across the Pearl River Delta from Hong Kong and Macau to Guangzhou via Shenzhen. This new form is truly innovative, not only in terms of size and population, as is the case with New York and its suburbs, for instance, but because it includes in the same space both urbanized and agricultural zones, open space and condensed areas. The construction of this megalopolitan infrastructure has been underway as early as 1995. In 2023, it includes a vast network of freeways, high-speed trains, bridges, and planes. but it still remains to legally bind this area together. To be clear, the megacity corresponds to the space of flows. They are the power centers of the information age. It is this distinctive feature of being globally connected and locally disconnected, physically and socially, that makes megacities a new urban form.
Some say time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds. Some say time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds. Time heals. Some say time heals all. Some say time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds. Time heals. Time heals.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bahar. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, if anyone in the audience has questions, you can use the Q&A function. But as always, I'll selfishly start out with some of my own. So I was thinking about our conversation and, around the subject, but around what ultimately became Free to Choose, which started when I encountered your short story, The Red Planet and the City of Capitalism, in 𝘊𝘱𝑚 architecture. Maybe you wrote when you were in the residency in Hong Kong. And that story followed sort of the same premise as the artwork, the final artwork, but the tone and medium are obviously much different. And so I wondered maybe if you could say a little bit about your collaboration with Ruta, with Waste Paper Opera, and how that collaborative process produced the operetta that we all got to enjoy.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. I think asking this question first is kind of essential to this project. For me also, in the past few months, as I'm talking to people about the project, I have to keep mentioning that it's been a new experience for me. to work in this kind of a collaborative environment with these people. I think it really ended up being, something that I hadn't encountered before. It's like a, it's a visual art piece made by 6 artists. And each of them really brought their, their complete, weird like flavor and understanding of the word to it. 𝘊𝘩𝘰𝘰𝘴𝘦, someone I worked with before on different projects. They're, they're amazing conceptual thinker. At the same time as they're, so crafty, they basically constructed all of the visual material for the work. And waste paper opera, Clara and James, Clara Coffin, and James Oldham and Gary, who basically waste paper, as you know, also they worked with Gary on this other project called Dead Cat Bounce, which was a performative opera on catastrophe and finance. So this kind of became the second chapter to it, and Gary was also involved with the project. Anna Palmer is also kind of co-composer of the, she's the co-composer of the piece with James. I think, to talk about it more conceptually, maybe, so much of the content of the film is about this kind of binarism of planning and, spontaneity with, market thinkers and socialist planners. And, in talking to Clara, throughout the project and, to waste paper opera, like there was this interesting kind of, generative tension between the form of the opera, which kind of becomes like, Soviet planning, because it needs to be so detailed and it needs to bring so many details to this kind of, to this fully formed like whole, like this totality of the piece. So there's like a lot of planning that goes into the opera, but with me and 𝘊𝘰𝘰𝘴𝘦, both of us are quite experimental artists. Like I don't start from a script usually. This is kind of one of the rare times that the text was written in advance. And that actually made me a bit uncomfortable with making something based on a text that's already written. But through the adaptations, which, Clara did the adaptation for the opera, it started to become more spontaneous in the same, format that I was used to. But basically kind of me and 𝘊𝘰𝘰𝘴𝘦, working in this very kind of like on a whim, making on the spot format with, the opera form was quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I was so happy that it happened. I mean, when you first wrote to me and said, I think maybe it will be an operetta, I had no idea what to expect. But when you told me it was waste paper and Gary, I was really disappointed that I wasn't able to see Dead Cat Bounce live. So I thought this would be an opportunity for me to get a taste of that experience. And yeah, and I mean, now that I think about it, I mean, even reading like Gary's new book, Catastrophe Time, almost gives me a similar feeling, I guess, as the first time I like encountered the short story in 𝘊𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰, because it's clearly so well researched, and all of this is impacting the narratives, but it also stands alone. It sort of builds its own world in a really compelling way. I think that's something about all your work. It's always sort of grounded in, research into historical figures or movements that are geographically and historically situated, and inextricably linked to economic phenomenon. Like I'm thinking of the first work of yours that I encountered after scarcity. But of course, that applies to Frida Choose. We see some familiar faces like Maggie Thatcher or Milton Friedman, but there seems to be a kind of a shift in the treatment of these characters. Like, to me, they appear less as historical figures and more as personifications of these economic models. But at the same time, the economic models that you're dealing with feel like metaphors for other more abstract concepts. So maybe you can elaborate on how some of the characters, named and unnamed, function in the video. I mean, even Philip Tose, who is kind of our surrogate, the one that we follow throughout the film, but who maybe you didn't discuss so much tonight.
Mm-hmm. I think actually surrogacy is a really good word to describe this. I haven't thought about it yet. I've been looking for the right word to describe the treatment of these kinds of characters. I mean, before Free to Choose last year, I also made a film with Elon Musk running down a desert with his car. And I think that was the start of kind of thinking, you know, through these, you know, these types of subjectivities. And yes, surrogacy is the right word. In case nobody, like somebody didn't, you know, get it in the room, I was lip syncing my own text. I mean, it's always like, it's, you know, it could go either way. It could be both lazy, but also there's something about, you know, when we started to make the film, immediately something intuitively about drag and, you know, impersonification. And playing through like somebody else's character, you know, came to the fore. The first scene of the film, we have Milton Friedman, you know, being lip synced by Anna kind of pretty accurately. And it's a very kind of uncanny, jarring feeling because she did such a good job of, you know, mimicking him. I think it took me a while to understand what's kind of the drive behind, you know, this kind of identification projection with these characters. But I think especially with these capitalist villains, you know, they're all kind of in a way like, you know, exemplify some sort of like, you know, villainness with in the, you know, in the capitalist structure. Yeah, I think that's actually the shift that you're pointing to. I think there was a shift from after scarcity to these types of projects, which maybe, I mean, it's also like a mode of self-critique. I think I became self-critical of my own critical alienation with the topics. And like the more I was exploring this idea of financialized subjectivity, and how I see, you know, the artistic subjectivity is, you know, goes in parallel with the financialized subjectivity, and they're not so much like a yin and yang, you know, and there's no kind of like moral, you know, there's not like a moral yardstick there that the artists are the good kinds of, you know, that kind of subjectivity, and the capitalists are the bad kinds. I think there's much more interplay between the two. So I kind of started to explore that idea of like, especially with Musk, like the question I was trying to ask was, what is it deep within us that's actually attracted to these kinds of characters? And, you know, if we be honest with ourselves, there is something there. That's why they exist in the world. Like if we deeply didn't like them, they wouldn't exist. So there is something that connects us. So I think I'm more interested now in like, you know, in almost like a vulgar way, like, you know, going deeper into this, that space of identification with these people. I don't know till when, maybe at some point I get tired, but.
Yeah, I mean, Musk is an interesting counterpoint because, yeah, I guess, you know, love him or hate him, like most people have an opinion on him, but someone like Philip Tose, I think, you know, has disappeared. And even in 1997, when he was, you know, bringing down whole economies, you know, I think that, you know, he was like a specter or something, right? He wasn't as visible, and maybe that's the nature of media, or maybe it's by design. There are two different types of villains of capitalism. There are those that you know, hide behind the scenes and pull strings, and then there are those who post, however unsuccessfully.
Yeah, I guess Toast is actually an exceptional case because people think of these people as undead, like nothing can break them down. But he was actually a very kind of like, you know, simple case of nobody, you know, nobody saved him. Like he was up there and he lost it all. I'm sure he didn't lose it all. He probably found, you know, a kind of mediocre job, you know, after the crash. I heard something about it, but I know like people in his circle, actually, there was, you know, that's usually what happens with these guys. There's like a high rate of suicide. after these events, like as far as I remember. But with him, I think, yeah, he kind of like disappeared from the map.
I'm sure there was some money in the British Virgin Islands or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking, you know, I mentioned it in the last question, but about the economic systems that you're dealing with in the work, and like their material implications. And I think that like something that's really interesting maybe with this approach, but in sci-fi in general, is that, you know, these systems, whether they're economic or sort of governmental, are often, and you know, probably by design, so complex that most of us have trouble grasping them. But the sort of translating these things into the realm of science fiction, you know, something like financial instruments as time traveling devices, you know, obviously it doesn't prepare us for like you know, being economists, but it makes them easier to understand in a way. Is this something also that's kind of developed in your writing or your visual practice over the years?
I think, yeah, that's also a great question. I think definitely more so with Free to Choose. It was more of a, you know, experiment in like a very classic kind of notion of sci-fi, and a very kind of like, you know, classic device with time travel. Like it wasn't trying to like over smart science fiction. Like it had a very, you know, simple plot line, like someone going to the future to borrow money for themselves. And actually the prompt was, you know, that's 𝘊𝘰𝘰𝘴𝘦is Varoufakis line, which I'm happy I got to use in the lecture performance. This quotes in the book that he wrote to his daughter on, you know, teaching her about the economy. He says, yeah, entrepreneurs are, you know, time travelers, and bankers are travel agents, the gatekeepers of time traveling. So that was really kind of like what the story was trying to explore, like all the different, you know, aspects of that, and especially in the context of Hong Kong and them merging with the Chinese system in the future. You know, what would that mean? Like, is there going to be a centralized time travel agency, or like, you know, a different model of it, basically? I think, yeah, definitely more so with Free to Choose than other projects.
Yeah. I guess, and I have to ask this because you mentioned like charter cities, for example, but earlier this year in a conversation with Royce Ng from 𝘊𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘰, we were discussing the sort of different like Western imaginaries of Hong Kong versus Singapore, specifically from the perspective of kind of urban futurists and sci-fi authors. And inevitably it sort of went down this rabbit hole, and we ended up discussing Friedman's grandson, Patrick Friedman. Yeah, so I wonder how you know, this kind of what anarcho-capitalist world building model sits next to something like the centralized model of a future you know, Hong Kong economic system that's inextricably linked to the Chinese planning model.
Yeah, I wish Clara was here also, because we were talking a lot with Clara about, you know, Queen Slobodian's latest book, Crack Up Capitalism.
Yeah.
It's actually entirely, have you got into it yet? Because that's entirely about this new generation of anarcho-capitalists. Like, he talks about Friedman's grandson. And there's this wonderful section where he's talking about, you know, his grandson runs this annual LARPs on this like remote island, like a medieval LARP on a remote island, and it's like his biggest investment in life is like doing that. And basically Slobodian is like doing a critique of LARPing, which is, you know, so popular now, with like some versions of, you know, anarcho-techno lefties. So yeah, I think, you know, when we talk about like surrogacy and you know, the dragness of the film and trying to embody these different things that, you know, you're not. And part of the blurb of the, you know, the work was, you know, how Hong Kong was essentially a metaverse for, you know, someone like Friedman. Like they were experimenting in these new, you know, economic models and currency models with almost zero, you know, repercussions or investments. Yeah, I think it's like quite interesting where that conversation has led with the, you know, with each generation of them and the levels of kind of virtualness, which is related to the theme of like the, you know, the program you're curating. Yeah, I think that's kind of the space that we're trying to develop more with Clara. Like we have some ideas in mind for future projects that might involve Friedman's grandson.
Are you allowed to share any? My next question was going to be what's next? Is there anything you want to plug? Are you allowed to share anything yet, or is it too early?
It would sound a bit like random probably, but if if it interests people, I think maybe I can share just like, you know, the one-liner is I'm thinking about you know, with the events that started in Iran in September, I was thinking about you know, a kind of revisiting of the neoliberal narrative in the context of Iran, and especially there's this very interesting, like coincidental, not coincidence actually, there's this moment in 1979 when Michel Foucault visits Iran, and he was basically obsessed with the Iranian revolution. He thought he kind of like figured out this new model of revolutionary subject deriving from like a non-Western framework. But what people usually don't mention, and you know, some scholars, Iranian scholars have written about it, like after Foucault leaves Iran, he basically writes his entire lectures on biopolitics, you know, coming out of that experience and like taking acid in the desert, like that whole kind of like self-care moment for Foucault also starts there. So we are imagining a kind of a parafictional moment where maybe Friedman or Friedman's son or grandson meets Foucault in a desert in Iran, and they have a conversation. Because I was trying to see if any of these neoliberals actually visited Iran, and apparently they haven't. That's why we're like, I was thinking to get into parafiction this time more.
Yeah, Foucault's psychedelic hallucination sounds like a great starting point for animation also.
Yeah, exactly.
We have one question in the Q&A, and then I'm mindful of time, but one of the attendees asked how you came up with the idea of time traveling as a way to borrow money from our future selves. What stories / films inspired you to take that route?
So the idea, as I said, was really kind of, you know, like kind of completely from Yanis Varoufakis' description of the credit system as a time traveling machine and bankers as the gatekeepers. In terms of stories and films, there are many. I think, I mean, it's also something that was in conversation between Clara, James, Ruda, me, Gary, like we kind of, you know, we are all talking in the language of vibes. So like someone would throw in, you know, like what one scene would like feel like to them. And if others vibed it, like everybody would go with it. But I also have like a relatively kind of mainstream, you know, taste in sci-fi. Like I like the grandmasters, like Kubrick and Tarkovsky. The last scene was actually inspired by the last scene in Mulholland Drive. Like we were thinking of that car ride in the desert, and you know, ending in this like nowhere land. And by the way, the meta-humans at the end are, you know, meta-humans of all our characters. It's the people who built the film. Yeah, so there are a lot of kind of like pop culture movie references throughout.
Well, I could stay here and talk to you all night. but I'm mindful of everyone's time. A reminder to everyone who's listening, you should check out Weird Economies also if you're interested in these sort of novel takes on ideas between society and economics. Everyone that Bahar brings together through Weird Economies is really insightful, smart folks. So yeah, thanks again, Bahar, for sharing Free to Choose with us and the rest of your practice. If anyone wants to see the film, Free to Choose will be viewable again at opensystems.sg beginning next week, a sort of recap period with the 17 other artworks, each of which are considering virtual spaces as sites for rehearsing these novel modes of social, political, and spatial organization. To everyone who joined us tonight, thank you to you as well. Do look out for more online programs from SAM, and if you're in Singapore, come visit us at Tanjong Pagar District Park. Till next time, and till I see you again, Bahar.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, everyone. Talk soon.